This is the second of two videos on the development of the northern economy in the 1600s, and this video is going to look at this how time passed a more urban manufacturing commercial based economy grew. Uh, Most people remained subsistence farmers, as I've said before, well into the colonial period, but given the environment, as time passed, you're going to see cities growing. Here we have a picture of Boston about the time of the Revolution, and Boston was about 15, 16,000 at that point. But these more industrial, not industrial, but manufacturing based industries that are growing up, they remain closely tied to the environment, and that's what we're going to focus on in this video. In later videos, we'll look at the economy of the South and so forth. When you start talking about the industries that began to grow, manufacturing and so forth, that the first real industry were the iron and iron furnaces. You can go all the way back to Puritan New England in the early 1600s with John Winthrop. It was actually the son of the original John Winthrop I've already mentioned. He realized that iron furnaces required a lot of charcoal for burning to get the necessary heat to make iron ore pliable or molten. And charcoal is wood that's heated in the absence of air until it's pure carbon. And it required, therefore, a lot of wood. The younger Winthrop realized that, unlike England, wood was plentiful in Massachusetts and pressed to create the first ironworks. Now, you might think that the English iron producers would say along mercantilistic lines that the Americans and the younger Winthrop shouldn't do this, but the younger Winthrop argued successfully that if the Americans developed an iron industry, it helped them export the tobacco and stuff down south. So he got permission and had a monopoly on American iron production for 20 years, and even had some English investors. But iron was probably the first industry to get started, and that was pretty daggone early. You can see how this industry would grow up first. If they could produce iron, they could make their own nails, horseshoes, pots, pans, plows. They could help their repair their weapons. Door hinges, door handles, keys, everything like that. They could make themselves and sell themselves. And so it was very, very critical to the beginning of a manufacturing economy as early, in early 1600s New England. The fur business was also a very, very early business in the North, as I've mentioned in the previous video. And it's going to continue to be a industry that will lead to the settlement of the West all the way to through the Rocky Mountains in the years to come. Companies would hire people to go out and trade with the Indians, barter, and there was actually, when you hear the term a buck, like a dollar, that was actually from them bartering deer skins. How much would you get for a buck? A buck is a deer, but anyway, beaver was the most popular fur, and that really impacted the early economy because beaver hats were in such demand in Europe as the 1600s got underway. Beaver hats were produced in a wide variety of popular styles: cocked, flat topped, flat crown, slouch, plume shovel, and even you think of the Daniel Boone type of beaver hat, the beaver tail in the back. But hatters in Europe used the soft inner barbed hairs of a beaver's fur because it stuck to the felt base made of rabbit hair in the hat. And there was just no combination nearly as good. The French exported tens of thousands of beaver skins, making the fur trade very early one of the extractive industries that would dominate the North. Eventually, even as early as the 1600s and out on the frontier, a lot of the beaver was already trapped out. Uh, Styles changed to a narrower brim hat as the 1600s went along, and as they were trapped out, they more and more they went to rabbit fur instead. Another industry that was early in the North and grew throughout the 17th century was the timber industry. Of course, think of the eastern woodlands and how thick they were. Companies would hire workers to descend into the forest with axes to fell, the large northern trees. I mean, again, think of Maine and the big tall trees. And then what they would do is they would float these big logs, down the river. And at some point, the water's flowing out of the mountains. It brings rocks down with it. The rocks accumulate in the ocean, in the river. And ocean-going boats can come up the river to that point where the rocks are. And that was called the falls of the river. So what these timber would do would float them down to the falls of the river, and there they would have a sawmill to pull them out of the water and cut the wood and then put them in the ocean-going vessels, who would then be able to go down the rest of the river. At the sawmills, huge water wheels powered large metal saws, and the saws themselves were controlled by a crank. And this type of sawmill was first introduced in Scandinavia in the 1400s. Later in the colonial years, sawmills improved to what was called the gang saws, parallel saws set in a frame that could cut a whole tree in only one pass-through of the saw. In any event, no matter what type of saw you used, working in these sawmills was difficult labor. You have to get the tree trunk floating down the river, out of the river, and into the sawmill, and then after it was cut, put the cut timber onto the ship. Because the large old growth trees of Europe had already largely been harvested by the 17th century, America's white pine tree, which grows up in the far north New England, was incredibly valuable for making masts. They didn't have a whole lot of trees like that left in Europe. In the northern colony of Massachusetts Bay, the white pine was so valuable, the king instituted what's called the broad and arrow policy, and that required a license to cut one down. It was another example of a mercantilist, king controlling the items of importance in trade. Related to the northern timber industry was the naval stores industry. When a cut is made in many trees, such as the longleaf pine tree, it's a lot around up north, turpentine could be extracted and distilled, and turpentine's that really sticky. If you've touched a pine tree, how sticky it is. Well, after the turpentine was distilled, what was left was resin and tar, which would then be cooked and boiled. Turpentine, resin, and tar were important to the shipbuilding business because they were used to coat the ship, making it more waterproof. Also, I should note that, it's very important to the barrel business. Making barrels waterproof is too. And, barrels are obviously critical to the shipping industry because they carried all the fresh water the seamen and the passengers would need. As the colonies developed and you get into late 1600s and the 1700s, the 18th century, a major shipbuilding industry naturally grew up in the northern colonies. They had all the natural ingredients, the timber, the naval stores, the good harbors, and so forth. And supplies are already there, so it's less expensive than taking all these supplies back to a shipbuilder in England for construction. So they started having a lot of shipbuilding industry, employing a lot of people in the north. Yet another industry that grew up in the 17th century north was the fishing industry. Particularly impressive for fishing was the Grand Banks off of Newfoundland. The Grand Banks were formed on the continental shelf between Newfoundland and the tip of Long Island. Icebergs from the cold Labrador current met with warm Gulf Stream current coming up from the south. If you ever been to Bermuda, it's actually pretty far north, but it's like in the Caribbean because it's in the middle of the Gulf Stream. Well, all of these warm Gulf Stream fish would follow the current up north of the Gulf Stream, and all the cold water fish would follow the Labrador current down, and they would meet here in the Grand Banks, and so it was a tremendous fishing location. The fishing vessels usually carried a crew of about 12 men who fished by hand with hemp lines and hooks. Through most of the colonial days, the fish were partially cleaned and stored in salt. As the colonial period passed and you get near the late 1600s and 1700s, more and more fishermen began to fish cod, drying the cod on the barren islands off of Newfoundland itself. But of course, all that was only during the summer. The great winters were tough for the fishing because you'd have these nor'easterns, again, not only the currents, but the cold from the north and the warmth from the Gulf Stream, and it would be hellacious storms forming up there. Fishing required tremendous amounts of salt, but it was relatively late in the colonial period, into the 1700s, before a major salt industry grew up in the north. They would pump seawater into vats where it evaporated under the sun and or maybe even over fires. In the late in the colonial period, salt springs were discovered in upstate New York, which of course helped. New England fishermen had to import salt from the Mediterranean for most of the colonial period because of the large fishing industry. Another industry that grew up in New England was the whaling industry. Whaling began as early as the mid-1600s off of Long Island, where the settlers, imitating the Indians, would watch the sea for whales who came in at low tide. When one appeared, a small boat with a small number of crew dispatched to try to harpoon it. Whale oil was prized as an excellent illuminant for lamps, and this was, of course, before there was kerosene or, of course, electricity. So it was valuable. The whale oil could burn and it could set off light. But it was the whale oil was also used in soap making and for lubrication. Whale bones were used for a variety of items, including hooks on women's corsets. You can see that on the right. Handles, just thousands of different carved artifacts. The sperm whale in particular was valuable because of its blubber oil. It was a waxy solid substance that it had the sperm whale had in its head, and it made great candles and ointments. If fishing off the Grand Banks in the winter was challenging and dangerous, the whaling business was always quite dangerous. Scared when it got harpooned, a whale could speed up to about 25 miles an hour, and the crew would just have to ride it out. I mean, they harpooned it, had a rope onto the harpoon, and it'd pull their little boat. They called it the Nantucket sleigh ride, as it was later called. But anyway, they'd have to ride it out until the whale tired, when the crew would then throw in some more harpoons and try to get into its head, which would kill it. And this whole process would end when the thrashing whale eventually just died, or so tired it couldn't resist anymore. But until that point, it could thrash around and destroy the boat with the crew in it. When the whale finally died, of course, the crew had to tow the bloody dead whale back to shore, which was hard to do in itself. So all these industries, whether you're working, if you were hired by a lumber company, or if you were a fisherman, or if you were in any of these industries, you had to buy, you use your wages and you would buy things you need. And this meant that a growing artisan and merchant industry. People weren't making, like subsistence farmers, they weren't producing all that they consumed. They had to buy things. And that is going to lead to the growth of many stores and, again, the cities. So as these cities grew, as the years passed in the north, and a more commercial, manufacturing, artisan-based economy, capitalist economy developed, the northern colonies' population grew tremendously, and it really outpaced the southern colonies in number and diversity. A real urban culture developed with this new growing type of commercial-based economy. This concludes the second of the two videos on how the northern economy developed in the 17th century and early 18th century. And next we'll move on to the southern economy in the same period.